I know that video is meant to be really like peaceful and soothing, but I just want there to be something more. That video stresses me out, which is ironic given the series that we're in, right? So yeah, as Steve said, I'm Martin. I'm a volunteer around here. Some weeks you'll find me in here. Some weeks you'll find me over in our youth congregation transit over the way. And I love being part of this community. And I've really enjoyed this series. I think this series has been a great way for us to consider as a church how we respond to some of those mental health issues, those mental well-being issues that we know are so prevalent in society. And we've been able to learn that they were equally prevalent back in the stories of the main protagonists that we find in the Bible. And if you've not been with us so far, we've talked about anxiety, we've talked about negativity, and worry. And if you've not been around, you're new here, you can catch up online, which I think is just a brilliant resource that we offer. So thank you to those of you who run that for us at the back. And I know that for lots of us, it's really hit a bit of a nerve. It might have opened up some wounds or given us an excuse to talk about things that maybe we feel a bit uncomfortable talking about. In fact, I was reflecting on this series with my friend Mike Walsh, one of our elders here, the other day over a coffee. And we kind of got to the conclusion that this is probably one of those series that lots of us might need to go back and watch in the future. Maybe if something goes on in our life or the life of somebody else that we know about. So do take advantage of that. Well, this week, I get to wrap up this series. And we're going to think about this issue called burnout. And we're going to try and work out a way that we can beat burnout. So when we talk about burnout, we're talking about what the World Health Organization calls an occupational phenomenon. So it's not a medical condition, but it's been classified as this group of symptoms or signs associated with specific health-related cause. I know that's a lot of words, okay? But basically, it's not officially medical, but it kind of is. That's kind of what it's saying. And in terms of the symptoms, it's this state of physical and emotional exhaustion, which can look like this. It can look like feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from your job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism about your job, and reduced professional efficacy. So we're just not doing our job very well. And some of you are sat there going, parenting. That's what that is. That's actually parenting. That's a result of being a parent. Well, even though I'd actually agree with you, when we talk about burnout, we're specifically talking about work-related things. It's often closely related to work. The rest of life could be rosy. It might not necessarily be. But work is then a different story. And let's name it. Anybody's job can be stressful. Any type of job, any hours we work, any type of job can be stressful. But not all of us will get to this stage. Not all of us will get to this burnout stage. Because it isn't limited to certain hours or even the length of time we've been in a certain job. It just seems to happen. And to build on that, Mental Health UK, who I got these symptoms from, in their burnout report that they released this year, they said that 91% of adults experience stress at work in the last year. And that's kind of believable. And also, stress in itself isn't bad. No, I think that's something we need to be really careful with. Stress in itself in certain ways can be really useful to us. It's why if I walked up to you and my fist was about to hit you in the face, you'd move. That's what stress causes us to do. But specifically related to burnout, 1 in 5 of those adults surveyed said that they'd had to have time off from work because of these kind of symptoms. Now, based on our recent attendances in adults on a Sunday, that's 40 people in this room who are suffering in this way. And to me, when I worked that out, it's some good maths, it took me a while, I really kind of felt sad about that. Because not just will those 40 people be suffering, but there'll be people around them suffering as a result of that. But this can be as a result of everything being on top of us. The bills, the job, the bills, the job, the kids, the bills, the health issues, the busyness of work can just tip us over the edge. And what I'm really pleased about is in this series, we haven't kind of tiptoed around them. We've really gone head on into these ideas. And also that very first installment of the series, we talked about the myths of mental health. Because I think sometimes there's this tension where if I stood up here and say, look, this isn't something we can just take to God and trust him to deal with, I could be accused of lacking faith. Because I should have faith in an amazing God who can fix anything. But likewise, if you walked up to me with your ankle dangling off your leg and I just said to you, go take it to God, you'd probably kick me with the other foot that isn't dangling off your leg. So what we want to try and do is kind of tie up how we can approach this from a faith-based sense, but also be really practical. How we can learn from some of those characters in the Bible and the love and guidance of a Heavenly Father who doesn't want us to be suffering in these ways, but also be practical. And two things I want to note really early on. Number one, if you're sat there and thinking, this is me, he's talking to me already, and you're feeling a bit freaked out by that, don't. That can happen in church. That's kind of a good thing. But secondly, if you are going through this, I want you to hear this. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry that this is your experience, because it really is tough. And you might be sat there having hid it for so long and finding it really hard. But you're not alone. And as we're going to see today, this has been experienced for generation upon generation. And if you are feeling some of these symptoms we've mentioned already, I want you to be introduced to a guy called Elijah. And Elijah's story is to be found in two main books in the Old Testament called 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And now we don't really know who wrote these books, but what they do is they guide us through the kind of origins of the monarchy, I guess, that it would have existed in Israel, and talks us through the story of these early kings of Israel. And it tells us the contrasting fortunes of those kings that really did live for God and those that really didn't. And one of those who really does live for God, even though he's not a king, is Elijah. I mean, Elijah's name means God is my God. So he's kind of sold himself out, or his parents sold himself out pretty early. And he's not just any old guy. He is a full-on, sold-out, committed man of God. He's a prophet, so somebody sent by God to spread messages to his people. He loved God. He's a proper powerhouse Old Testament character. But he suffered. He suffered from real anxiety, real stress, and burnout, just like some of us do in 2024. And so if you're sat there thinking you're a bad Christian for having the mental health issues you are, you're not. And take heart that even those stories in the Bible tell us that lots of people do. So just to give you a bit of background to the story before we get into the main bit of it. This is occurring around 3,000 years ago, and Elijah is told by God to go and confront this king called King Ahab. And Elijah goes up to King Ahab and he says, look, you are sinning against God because you've let idol worship happen in your kingdom. And he prophesied to Ahab that because of this failure on his behalf, there's going to be drought in Ahab's kingdom for 3 years. And they took this kind of thing really seriously. I'm sure if I went up to King Charles and said, some things aren't great, there's going to be drought, I just don't think he'd take me seriously. But they did in that kind of time. So as a result of this, King Ahab, let's say, got a tad annoyed at Elijah, and meant that Elijah had to go on the run. So he was a fugitive, essentially. He had to go into hiding as Ahab has sent his armies to go and track him down and kill him, because obviously that would solve the idol worship problem, I'm sure. And the story continues and tells us that for these 3 years that Elijah is on the run, God protects Elijah. And during that time, Elijah performs these miracles on behalf of God to convince more people about who God was. And there's one brilliant story where Elijah stares down 850 angry men who believed their God was better than Elijah's God. And if you want a bit of Game of Thrones meets the Bible, I really recommend going to find that story in the book of 1 Kings, because it's a great one, but it's a bit confusing as well. But where we're at so far is that Ahab is annoyed because Ahab is losing. Because Elijah's still doing all the things that he didn't want Elijah to be doing. And I'm about to get a loud cheer, I can sense it already. Because King Ahab did what all men do when things aren't going well. They call for a woman. That's what they do. I heard some cheer. I definitely saw some nudging there as well. That's what happened, okay? So up steps King Ahab's queen, Queen Jezebel. Now, this is the Jezebel that lends itself to the modern moniker of like impudent, shameless, unrestrained woman. Some unfortunate nudging going on there as well. But you might be getting a bit of an idea of what she's like. So Jezebel sends this messenger to Elijah on behalf of King Ahab. And this messenger says to Elijah, Queen Jezebel says, by this time tomorrow, you're dead, mate. See? Lovely woman. And Elijah crumbles. This Elijah that's been on the run for 3 years, been protected by God for 3 years, had the ever-present provision of God, knows that God's beautiful and glorious presence is with him, and stood down 850 men on behalf of God crumbles because one woman made a threat. See, you women are powerful. And I kind of get it, because it's amazing what we can actually endure. Someone criticizes you. Your kids are causing a problem. The bills are mounting up. You're dealing with stress at work. You're financially feeling the pressure. You get that health report that you never wanted. And you handle it, and you handle it, and you handle it until there's one thing too many and we fall apart. The straw breaks the camel's back. And to Elijah's camel, see Jezebel's straw. And all she did was make a threat. We actually see no evidence that she actually sent actual men to actually kill him. What makes Elijah crumble is just the threat. There's no army, there's no mercenaries, there's no like ninjas hiding in the corner of the story. There's just a threat. And Elijah crumbles because of those things that can so get to us. It's what Sarah mentioned a couple of weeks ago when she was up here talking with Steve. It's the what ifs. It's fear. And so Elijah, being full of fear, legs it. 1 Kings 19 verse 3 tells us that Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. There's the fear right there. And he runs to this place called Beersheba in Judah. And this line there, he left his servant there. We're going to come back to that in a bit. So just clip that in your mind a bit. We're going to come back to that. And it says he left his servant there, and then he journeys for another day into the desert, dropped down under a tree, and says this. He said, I've had enough, Lord. I'm done. I'm fully done, burnt out. Take my life. And as soon as he says that, he falls to sleep, which is your classic burnout symptom of exhaustion. And a lot of people who get into this state also have this chronic loss of self-confidence and a chronic feeling of self-doubt. You'll feel like you're a failure, that you don't have what it takes, that you're not good enough anymore. And then you start to feel isolated and maybe even isolate yourself because you don't want other people to know that you're feeling these things, because that will make you feel more like a failure. And then you just feel more alone and then just generally miserable. And all of those things that brought you joy in the past don't anymore. And then you could get even more cynical and bitter about things. And what often happens if you're a person of faith is you can even lose faith in God. That might have been your story in the past, or somebody you know. As you start to blame God, like, God, why have you got me in this place? Why have you let this happen to me? What's the point? I'm no good at this anymore. I can't take it. I'm done. I've had enough. And I know this because about 8 years ago, I think I was right on the cusp of this myself. No, on the cusp. I don't think I quite got fully into it, but I was on the cusp. I know I was close. And this is when, as some of you who have been around here for a number of years may remember, this was when I was working here for our church. On the outside, to most people, everything probably looked fine. I would have been up here doing this, or down there doing my job, and people kept saying I was doing a decent job of my job. And I kept going and going and going and put on a brave face for months because I didn't want anybody to know, because that would look weak, right? But deep down, I was so numb and so lost. I wasn't overworked, but I was overwhelmed. I kept going and going and going until I couldn't anymore. And like I said, the straw that breaks the camel's back, well, I think my back was in a bad way, put it that way. And I felt some of the feelings that Elijah did. Now, fortunately for me, I still had just enough mental capacity to stop myself getting into the really dangerous territory of this, because it can be really dangerous. And the weird bit was, many of you in here would have been so lovely to me. I felt appreciated, not just by my employers, but by everyone in the church as well. But I couldn't hear it. You said it, I listened, but I couldn't hear it. And so I became cynical and doubted everything and found little happiness anywhere. And I felt so broken internally. And I think what did prevent me getting into the really dangerous territory was actually that I could be honest and vulnerable with my employers and some of my colleagues, mainly Steve, and also my friends Finn and Kat Johnston when they were employed here, our mates that now live out in Nashville in the States. Because often when we get to these things, at home we can break down and be horrible, and I was at times, but then we have to go hide it again at work. We have to put on the brave face or the mask again at work because I can't do that. That would look weak. But fortunately for me, I could cry at work as much as I could at home, and I did a lot. And having those people at work was amazing, because even though I had, and still have, a very incredibly supportive wife and incredibly supportive friends, they're not at work with me when those things get to me. They're not there with you all the time, whereas Steve and Kat and Finn were, and I knew they were for me. They wanted what was best for me, and that was so meaningful. And no matter how much they helped, I was still so lost. Because I thought that working for church was what God had wanted for me. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But the working bit wasn't working. Church work was breaking me straw by straw by straw. And please don't get the idea that I'm bitter about it. If you want the proof, I'm still here, right? I'm still fully sold out on this mission to help people find and follow Jesus. But after some really tough conversations and soul search alongside others, I came to the decision that the working bit wasn't working for me. And I remember when I told people, it came as a huge surprise to many people. Obviously, not many would have known really what was behind it internally. But the thing with burnout and mental health in general is that so often it's all internal and invisible to the outside world. We don't always know what's going on in people's behind the scenes. I remember talking to Becky Warnock, who still works for the church now, probably on the day I said to the staff team or just before, and I vividly recall her saying to me, nobody would know. Well, now you all know. So how did I get there? Well, I think there's some similarities with what Elijah did and how he ended up where he did. Because Elijah just kept going and going and going, even when the warning signs started to sound. And he literally ran for miles and miles. From Mount Carmel, which is where he had this confrontation with the 850 men, to Beersheba, where he left his servant, is around 100 miles. Like over wilderness, arid land. And he literally ran himself into the ground and collapsed, just like we can do. Because we so often feel like enough is never enough. We feel like we've got to be the perfect parent or the perfect aunt or the perfect brother or sister. We've got to provide. We've got to be at every single event. We've got to be there, do that in the best way possible. We've got to do that as well. We can't show any weakness. I definitely can't show any weakness. I've got to do all of that. I've got to be strong. I've got to make that meeting. I've got to do this. I've got to be at that event. I've got to be there and there at the same time. And we feel like enough's not enough. So we just keep pushing on, even though it's harming us. That's mistake number one. Secondly, we try to do it all on our own. Remember what I told you to hold on to? What did Elijah do en route? He left his servant there. His support network was abandoned. His servant that could have helped him out, maybe, was abandoned. How much harder is life when we have nobody to turn to? Like, it's why we as a church are so upfront about the power of groups and being with groups of people who can support us. And I really hope you know the sense of having a strong support network around you. But let's be honest, sometimes we can be too proud, maybe, to ask for help or to ask for support. And we just make excuses for not being part of those things. And we can suffer as a result. And that's mistake number two. And actually, I think that's the mistake I didn't make and people didn't let me make. So that's what stopped me doing something really silly. And thirdly, we just dwell on the negative. There can be so much good going on, but we can't see the wood from the trees. And it becomes self-perpetuating that all we see is the stuff that's wrong. And as Elijah is sat under this tree, just before he falls asleep, he says to God, I'm no better than my ancestors before me. He thought he'd have been better than other amazing characters we can read about in the Bible, like Abraham and Moses, all of them who made mistakes as well. And Elijah's like, I'm just rubbish, mate. I'm no good at this. He gets caught in this comparison trap where we look at others and we think, I need to be like that, and they do that by this, so I've got to do more. Or we look at a situation, we just see no way out of it, and so we reach the end of our already exhausted tether and just say, I've had enough. But here's some hope. Despite all that you might be feeling right now, I want you to know God's not done with you. And he wasn't done with Elijah either. Because we're going to see in this main act of Elijah's story just how God was constantly with him. And God may be nudging you, offering you his strength when you are weak. Maybe it's the very reason you're here today. Maybe that statement has made you think of somebody that you need to get to church in the future because you know they need it, or to invite them to watch back online. Now, a word of caution before I continue with the rest of the story. There's something in this bit of the story that I don't get, have never got, even though I've studied it a lot. They're mentioned often in the Bible, but I just don't get them. Angels. Okay? I really struggle with the concept of angels. Because for me, the Bible doesn't tell me enough about them, where they're from, what they're actually like, and things like that. So just hold on to that. That's a discussion for another day, and I think we're fully allowed not to get everything in the Bible. I think that's absolutely justified. But when we hear about angels in this part of the story, I've had to train my mind to just see them as messengers from God. So if you are also confused by angels, let's just go with that for now. We'll assume they're messengers from God doing God's work. So with that in mind, we hear that this angel kind of nudges Elijah. Maybe taps him on the shoulder or gives that gentle rub like you do to wake up a sleeping child. Why do we wake up sleeping children? It's stupid. But we do it, okay? I imagine, honestly, why do we do it, okay? Anyway, but this angel rubs Elijah on the shoulder to wake him up. And this angel says this, "Hey, loser, what are you doing hiding under the bush? Little scared of Queen Jezzy, are you? It's a prayer problem, mate. If you prayed more, you wouldn't be here. Up your faith game." Of course, the angel doesn't say that. If you actually thought it did, that worries me, okay? It worries me because of this, because God never condemns us for where we're at. Where we find ourselves, God doesn't call us out on it like that. God says, "I'm here for you." He says, "Here's my love, here's my protection, no matter where you got to and why you got there." And some of us are crying out for that knowledge today. And boy, did Elijah cry out for it. And you might be a little underwhelmed by what God says to Elijah through the angel next, because Elijah is told to do this. Get up and eat. That's it. Now, some of you might be thinking, great, God tells me to eat. Brilliant, happy with that, okay? But I reckon if you're Elijah, you are so annoyed right there. But our God is a practical God as well. God knows what's best for ourselves. He wants us to take care of ourselves physically. And after Elijah did this, he then has another nap, proving that sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is rest. The Sabbath, time off, separation from the grind. And we all know the problem. We know the problem is when we try and rest, our head goes, yeah, but you've got to do this, and you've got to be there, and you've got to do that, and you've got to do that. But in his commandments, God tells us to rest before he tells us not to murder and steal. So I reckon he's pretty serious about it. We need to be replenished and energized. This is holy living. But also what we need really on top of this practical stuff is to experience God amidst all of the chaos. More than just a nudge that Elijah got so far, we need to experience God working in our lives, knowing he's with us. We don't just need knowledge of him, we need an encounter with him. Knowledge of God is one thing, but to be with him and to know he's with us is an entirely different thing. And this is then what happens to Elijah. After he's replenished, in this practical sense, God then seeks to replenish him in his spiritual, mental, emotional sense. And we see that Elijah had been strengthened by that food. And so he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night. And it's here where this real interaction happens. And God speaks to him, but then Elijah replies in a way that just kind of shows us so much about where he's going. So God says, "I'm going to talk to you here." And Elijah goes, "I've been so zealous for you, God. I've done everything you wanted. The other Jews, the other Israelites, they've rejected your covenant. In other words, they've not followed any of your commands you sent through Moses. They've torn down your altars. They've put your prophets to death with a sword. I'm the only one left, and now you're trying to kill me too." Can you see he's done? It didn't get solved immediately after the food and the rest. There's still more to come. And so the angel, there we go, the angel's back again, on behalf of God says this. The angel says, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord's about to pass by." And I reckon Elijah was like, "What? I've just cried out for you, asking for help, and you've said, come and watch this, basically come and watch a train come past." That's like, it's equivalent of what's going on. Because it riles with us, right? When we cry out to God with something about a situation and he doesn't respond to it, he doesn't fix it, it grates with us. Again, it can make some people really give up on faith and doubt God's even there. But Elijah doesn't get there. Elijah still believes that God can help him. So maybe reluctantly, he goes and stands outside this cave. And here God makes himself known in this way. It says, and a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. That's where Elijah found God. Not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, not in the noise. In here, God wasn't in the extraordinary. He was in the ordinary. God was in the whisper. If we'll just be still and slow down, he might speak to us in the ordinary moments. When we're washing up, when we're walking the dog, brushing your teeth. If we make and take opportunities to listen, God is always there, whispering to us. We just make everything noisy sometimes. And I was thinking, why does he make it so hard then? Especially when we're going through something so tumultuous as burnout. Why doesn't he scream loudly to rescue us? Maybe it's because it would actually freak us out even more. If our brain's already frazzled so much, if God then appears in an earthquake, I don't know how we'd cope with that. But I also think it's God's way of showing us he's so close that a whisper will do, if we just listen carefully enough. The whisper drew Elijah out of his cave. And if you're in the darkness of despair, if you're in your mental health cave right now, God's whispering to draw you out. I really believe that. And he'll say, if you're brokenhearted, I'm close to the brokenhearted. If you're overwhelmed and burdened by work pressure, I save those who are crushed. If you're feeling hurt, you're not helpless. If you're feeling discouraged, you're never without hope. You might say, I feel weak. I can't go on anymore. Just like Elijah did. God says, my strength will sustain you. He says, I'm with you. Follow me. And in the New Testament part of the Bible, Jesus says much the same. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and you will find rest for your souls. Jesus is saying, let me be in control. Walk my way. Stop doing what the world does. Walk my ways, and it will be best to you. He's saying, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. Walk alongside me, and I'll show you what real living is. So what do you need today, church? Do you need rest to be still before God? We might need some different rhythms and a different type of rest. We might need something a bit more radical. But I promise you, having Jesus with you will be good. I can promise you need Jesus. And an encounter with a good God who is there for us, even when it feels like everything is against us. And he's in the ordinary. And if we put ourselves in a position to hear him, maybe that will help us get where we need to be. And you might be thinking, yeah, I agree with that. This is great. But how do I do that? I remember at the start of this series, I was hosting on the day we watched the video intro, and I said, we'll get to the practical stuff. And I feel like I've got to fulfill my promise now. So I'm going to be very, very practical. Because I want us to be practical so that we can encounter a God who really is for us. So I'm going to wrap up by giving a range of ways that we could practically help ourselves. It won't suddenly fix your burnout. If you are in this burnout, it's not going to be you leave here, bang, all done. It won't, I'm sorry. But it might just be the beginning of your journey out of it, or maybe even the things that stop you getting into it in the first place. So 5 suggestions, what we could do. All of you sat here, you're going to think, good, number 1, got that. You ready? Number 1, get to church. I think being here is a start. 1 hour a week to purely focus on God is a good start because it is that separation from everything else. God told us to keep the 7th day holy, and all that means is to separate it, to make it something else from the grind. And I think we need to make this a priority rather than the thing we do if we're not busy getting busier somewhere else. Because if you want to hear God whispering, I reckon he's quite likely to talk here. Like, God's not limited to here. This place, I mean, this is a leisure centre, okay? Come on. Like, this place isn't special. God's everywhere. But being here in this atmosphere might allow us to encounter God differently. Number 2, find 15. How do we encounter God the rest of the week? Where could we carve out some time to listen to God's whispering? How do we come to Jesus like he told us to? You know, all of our weeks look different, but I challenge you to find 15 minutes a day, or maybe 15 minutes a week, or a couple of times a week to start. Maybe where you can read what God is saying to us through the Bible. Maybe sticking on our church playlist that is linked through Forge Feed. And if you don't know what Forge Feed is, go back to Next Steps afterwards, they'll tell you. Maybe it's just sitting still and asking God to speak to you. Or maybe it's sitting with somebody else who you think is further down their journey than you are, asking for their wisdom for 15 minutes. The truth is that even if you're not suffering with these burnout things, these habits are so important. Jesus did it. I think he's worth following his example. So get to church, find 15. Thirdly, relinquish. And some of us are going to find this really hard. Now, I realized I've kind of left Elijah's story a little bit unfinished. Well, we see that after the whispers that he experienced, he had a bit of a mini recovery. But his mini recovery started with him going back to his servant and actually appointing other people to do some of his jobs for him. There's a lot in that. Maybe you need to relinquish something that's preventing you from focusing on what's really important. Maybe it's time we learn to say no. Maybe we need to relinquish the feeling like I need to say to everybody, yeah, I'm busy. As if being able to say life is busy is some kind of badge of honor. That kind of culture is so damaging. You know, I really believe God values us working hard at things. I really do. But he told us to have rest. Number 4, maybe for you it's about being an advocate. Maybe you need to be the person who keeps somebody else accountable to do this because this burnout situation isn't real for you. Maybe you need to be a real advocate for people who are suffering. No, Jesus called us to love one another as he loved the church, which means we have to sacrifice. So maybe you could use your influence in your workplace to create a positive mental health practice. If you've got influence, if you've got leadership roles in your organization, use it for the benefit of others. That's loving people. That's being like Jesus. We can learn about angels if you want, but being like Jesus is way better. Trust me. You know, we can't, I'm not saying this will fix people's mental health, but we can try and be a support and try to prevent it being as much a problem in the future, just like I had around me. I don't know where I'd be if I didn't have that. And if you want a really simple way to do that, when you ask somebody if they're okay, say, yeah, all right. Then look them in the eye and go, are you really okay? It's a big difference. Might just open up a conversation to prevent them tipping over the edge. And finally, eat, sleep, and move. You know, God told Elijah to get up and eat. He told him to replenish himself first. We can do those things. We can look after ourselves properly and make some little changes and make them into better habits. I said finally, I lied. One more thing. I'm going to recommend this. Okay, there's an image of it on the screen as well. This is a book by he's a church leader in Canada. He now does a lot of leadership stuff called Carey Nieuwhof. And when I was getting towards the stage where I realized what was going on with me 8 years ago, I read this. It was amazing because it really gave me a sense of, oh, that's what's going on. It gave me some real practical tips for how to maybe get out of there as well. And I would really recommend, if you're a reader, I really recommend this. My suggestion is you screenshot it because his name's really hard to spell. Okay? If you want to have a look at it afterwards, I'll let you have a look. I'm not going to be generous and give it to you because I think I might need this at some point. I think I might need to reread this at some point in my life. I really believe our God is a practical God. And I hope you find something there that can help you with where you're at. But I believe God wants to continue to be in communication with us. He wants to continue to whisper to us. So just before we sing together again, I'm going to pray for us. And so can I invite you to stand, church? And I'm going to pray for us. If you want to stand with your hands open, fine, as a kind of symbol that you want to get something from God today, that you want to hear him, go for it. I believe he'll do it anyway. But you can do that. So let me pray for us. Father, I want to pray for all of us suffering right now. All of us that want to scream out, I've had enough, and run just like Elijah did. I ask, God, that you make yourselves known to them in such a clear way right now, and that they hear your whisper and respond to it. Lord, for those of us that need to make changes, strengthen us to do so. If it involves difficult conversations that we don't know how to start, give us an opening to do so. I thank you that you've placed me and us in this church community that really does care for each other. And I thank you that you promise to always be with us. May we know that, may we feel that, and may we move towards really understanding about the real rest that you offer us. In your name I pray. Amen.